2 o'clock in the afternoon, October 10th, 1913. In an office in Washington, D.C., President Woodrow Wilson stands at his desk and rests a finger on a telegraph key. He is 4,000 miles from the thing he is about to destroy. He presses it. The signal leaves the White House and runs south, overland to Texas, under the Gulf, down the coast of Mexico, past Nicaragua, into Panama. It covers the distance in less than 4 seconds. At the other end of that wire stands an earthen wall called the Gamboa Dike. It is the last thing on Earth holding 2 oceans apart. Behind it sits a lake that did not exist 10 years ago. In front of it lies a dry trench, 9 miles long, cut straight through a mountain range. 30 years of work, 2 nations, tens of thousands of lives, 400 charges of dynamite fire at once. The people gathered on the hillsides say it sounds like artillery a long way off, a low rumble. Then water and mud and rock go up into the air together, and a cloud of smoke spreads outward over the lake. And then the water comes through. It finds the gap, widens it, and begins to cut its own channel. Within minutes, it is pouring down the length of the trench. Newspapers around the world call it the wedding of the oceans. But look closely at what actually poured through that hole. It was not the sea. No ocean rushed in that afternoon. What came through the broken dike was lake water, the dammed Chagres River, held in a reservoir 85 feet above sea level in the middle of a jungle. It was rain. The first water that ever moved through the Panama Canal fell out of the sky over a mountain range in Central America. And more than a century later, that has never changed. The busiest shortcut on the planet does not run on engineering. It runs on weather. This is Panama. A country 50 miles wide at its narrowest point. 2 coasts you can drive between in under 2 hours. Rainforest that begins where the city ends. And through the middle of it, a waterway that carries around 6% of everything the world moves by sea. Ships come here from every ocean. Container vessels stacked 9 boxes high, grain carriers out of the American Gulf, gas tankers from Texas, cars from Japan and Korea. And every one of them is here for the same reason. The alternative is Cape Horn. From New York to San Francisco, going around South America is a voyage of roughly 13,000 miles. Through Panama, it is about 5,000. The canal does not just save time, it changes what is worth shipping at all, which is why what happened here in 2023 mattered so much, and why so few people saw it coming. The rain stopped. Not entirely. But Panama's wet season runs from May to December, and in 2023, the rain came in below average for 7 of those 8 months. It was one of the driest years the country had ever recorded. Gatún Lake, the reservoir that is the canal, began to fall. By the autumn, it had dropped to levels not seen since at least 1965. The Panama Canal Authority did the only thing it could do. It began turning ships away. In a normal year, 36 to 38 vessels crossed the isthmus every day. By November 2023, that number was cut to 24. By early 2024, on some days, it was closer to 18. Draft limits fell too. A container ship that would normally sit 50 feet deep in the water was restricted to 44. Less water beneath the hull means less cargo above it. Ships arrived and left half-loaded. Others did not come at all. They went the long way round, down past Argentina or across to the Cape of Good Hope, and absorbed the extra weeks. Behind the canal, at anchor, the queue grew. Shipping companies began auctioning their way to the front, and the price of a single slot climbed into the millions. And the cause of all of it, the reason a fifth of the world's container traffic between Asia and the eastern United States began to hesitate, was that it had not rained enough on a range of green hills you have never heard of. So how did the shortcut between the world's two largest oceans end up depending on the weather? The answer is not in the ships, it is in the ground beneath them. Three million years ago, this place did something to the planet that nothing has undone since. For most of Earth's history, the Atlantic and the Pacific were one continuous body of water. Currents ran freely between them, straight through the gap where Central America now sits. North and South America were separate continents, drifting apart, connected to nothing. Then the seafloor between them began to rise. Volcanoes pushed up from below, sediment filled the gaps. Slowly, over millions of years, a chain of islands became a ridge, and the ridge became a wall. Around 3 million years ago, the wall closed, and the ocean had to find another way. Water that had flowed west into the Pacific was turned north instead. It became the Gulf Stream, the warm current that runs up the eastern seaboard of North America and across to Europe, and that keeps the coast of Norway free of ice in January. The Isthmus of Panama did not just join two continents, it rewired the climate of the northern hemisphere. And the animals came. Ground sloths the size of cars walked north. Armadillos and porcupines and opossums followed. Coming the other way, south, came cats, bears, horses, and eventually people. Biologists call it the Great American Interchange, one of the largest reshufflings of life the planet has ever seen, and it happened because of this strip of land. Panama is a bridge. It has always been a bridge. The canal is only the most recent thing that has crossed it. But the same geology that made Panama a bridge made it a wall. And that is the problem that no engineer could dig their way around. The Isthmus of Panama is narrow, but it is not flat. Running along its spine is a continental divide, a ridge of hills that climbs to more than 300 feet above sea level in the middle of the country. Which means a canal cut straight through, at the level of the sea, would require removing a mountain. Not tunneling under it, removing it. Every ton of it, by hand and by shovel, in a climate that killed men faster than they could be replaced. That was the plan the French arrived with. Ferdinand de Lesseps was 74 years old when he came to Panama, and he was the most celebrated engineer alive. He had built the Suez Canal. He had cut 100 miles of ditch through the Egyptian desert and joined the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and he had done it at sea level, without a single lock. He saw no reason Panama should be different. Suez is sand. Panama is rock, rain, and river. The work began in 1881. Within a few years, the men digging in the cut were watching the walls of their own trench slide back into it every wet season. The Chagres River, which the plan largely ignored, flooded without warning and washed out entire camps, and the mosquitoes were already there. Nobody understood yet what yellow fever and malaria actually were, or how they moved. Hospitals in Panama City stood the legs of their beds in bowls of water to keep the ants off the patients. The bowls bred mosquitoes. The hospitals were killing the people inside them. By 1889, the French company was bankrupt. It had shifted a great deal of earth and finished nothing, and it had buried, by most estimates, some 22,000 men. The Americans arrived 15 years later, in 1904, and made two decisions that the French had not. The first was medical. William Crawford Gorgas was an army doctor who had already cleared yellow fever out of Havana, and he arrived in Panama certain that the enemy was not the jungle, or the heat, or the rock. It was an insect. His plan was mocked. He was asked more than once why the Canal Commission should spend a fortune on wire mesh and kerosene when there was digging to be done. He did it anyway. His teams fumigated every building in the canal zone. They screened windows, they drained standing water, oiled the surface of ponds so larvae could not breathe, and cut back brush around every settlement along the line. They went house to house, and then they did it again. Yellow fever, which had emptied the French camps, disappeared from the isthmus within 2 years. Malaria did not disappear. It never has, but the death rate collapsed. Gorgas did not dig the canal. He made it possible to dig the canal. The second decision was the one that defines Panama to this day. The Americans gave up on cutting through at sea level. Instead of removing the mountain, they decided to go over it, and to do that, they would need to lift every ship that crossed, 26 meters into the air, and then set it down again on the other side. And to lift a ship, you need water. Here is how it works. At each end of the canal, a ship enters a chamber, a concrete box roughly 1,000 feet long, big enough to hold a vessel with a few feet to spare on either side. The gates close behind it. Then valves open in the floor. There are no pumps. There have never been pumps. Water flows into the chamber from the lake above, purely by gravity, because the lake is higher. The ship rises with it, like a bath filling. When the water inside the chamber matches the water in the next one, the gates ahead open, and the ship moves forward into the next box. And it happens again. 3 steps up on one side, 3 steps down on the other. It is a staircase. The Panama Canal is a staircase, and every stair is filled from a bucket of rain. And when the ship reaches the far side and the last gate opens, all that water, every liter used to lift it, runs out into the sea. It is not recovered. It cannot be recovered. It is gone. Roughly 200 million liters of fresh water per ship, per crossing, 36 ships a day. The Panama Canal is the only waterway on Earth that spends a river to move a boat. And to be clear, this is not a design flaw. It is the reason the canal exists at all. Seawater cannot be used in the locks. It would corrode the machinery, poison the lake, and destroy the freshwater ecosystem that the entire watershed depends on. The lake has to be fresh. And a lake that is spent every day has to be refilled every day. There is only one thing that refills it. It rains here. It rains enormously. Parts of the canal watershed take more than 3 meters of rainfall a year, 10 feet of water falling out of the sky onto the hills above the locks. In a normal year, that is more than enough. The canal was designed for a normal year. Above the locks, in the hills where the water is made, there is a forest. It is not scenery, it is infrastructure. The Chagres River rises in these mountains and runs west and north, gathering everything that falls on the slopes above it. It was the river that flooded the French camps and drowned their work. Now, it is the river that fills the lake that lifts the ships. Panama protects it with a national park, not for its beauty, though it has that in abundance, but because the forest is the thing that holds the water. Trees slow rain down. Roots hold soil in place. Without the canopy, a heavy downpour would run straight off the hillside, carrying earth with it, and the reservoir would silt up and empty faster than it could fill. The forest is the machinery. Cut it down, and you break the canal. Which means Panama has one of the few economies on Earth with a direct, measurable, financial reason to keep its rainforest standing. Inside that forest, along the upper Chagres, there are villages. The Embera have lived on these rivers for generations, in open-sided houses raised on stilts above the floodline, reachable by dugout canoe. Their livelihoods and the canal's livelihood are now the same livelihood. What protects one protects the other. And in the canopy above them, the forest is anything but quiet. Before dawn, the sound begins. It carries for miles, a deep, rolling roar that new arrivals mistake for a jaguar or for weather. It is a monkey the size of a small dog. The mantled howler has an enlarged bone in its throat, a hollow chamber that turns its voice into an amplifier. It is one of the loudest land animals on the planet, and it is loud for a reason. Howler troops do not fight over territory if they can avoid it. They shout across the canopy instead, and the shouting settles the matter before anyone gets hurt. They eat leaves, a poor, low-energy diet that requires them to sit still and digest for much of the day. A howler monkey spends most of its life doing almost nothing, and that is precisely why they are still here. When the water rose behind the Gatún Dam and drowned this valley, the howlers did what a slow, leaf-eating, low-energy animal is uniquely able to do. They stayed. They climbed to the high ground, watched the world fill up around them, and kept eating leaves on what had suddenly become an island. They are still shouting from those hilltops today, over a lake that did not exist when their ancestors first climbed those trees. So let us go to the place where the mountain had to be cut. They called it Culebra, the snake. It is the narrowest, deepest, most difficult stretch of the entire crossing. 9 miles where the canal passes not through jungle or lake, but through the continental divide itself. To get a ship across Panama, this ridge had to come out of the ground, not tunneled, removed. At the peak of the work, 6,000 men were in the cut at any one time. 300 rock drills running at once, 60 or 70 steam shovels, each feeding a line of railway wagons that carried the spoil away and dumped it somewhere else. Constant explosions, all day, every day, the sound rebounding off the walls of the trench. And it was hot. Down in the cut, with the rock throwing the sun back up at the men standing on it, temperatures reached 120 degrees. They dug it out, and the hillsides slid back in. This is the part of the story the engineering diagrams never show. The rock of the Culebra Cut is soft, layered, and unstable, and it had been holding itself up for millions of years by leaning on itself. When the diggers took the middle out, the sides had nothing left to lean on. So they came down, again and again. The Cucaracha slide alone pushed millions of cubic meters of earth back into the channel. Slides buried track, swallowed steam shovels, and in places reclosed a trench that had taken years to open. The engineers stopped talking about how much earth they needed to remove and started talking about how much earth the mountain was going to give back. In the end, more than 76 million cubic meters came out of the Culebra Cut alone. The man who ran it was David Dubose-Gaillard, an army engineer from South Carolina. For years he stood in that trench and watched it fill in behind him, and he kept ordering it dug out again. He was there in the spring of 1913 when the steam shovels finally met in the middle at the bottom of the channel. He was not there when the water came through. He fell ill that summer, went home to the United States, and died in December 1913, after the dike was blown, before a single ship ever passed through the cut he had spent his life digging. They named it after him. Most people still call it Culebra anyway. And this is usually where the story stops. The engineers, the steam shovels, the photographs of men in white hats standing on a mountain of spoil. But look at who is holding the drills in those photographs. By 1907, 3/4 of the workforce on the isthmus came from the West Indies. Most of them came from one island. Between 1904 and 1916, more than 45,000 Barbadians left for Panama. That was close to 1/4 of the entire population of Barbados. They traveled on the open decks of steamships, crowded together in the weather, and the men who made that crossing were known in the language of the time as deckers. They came because Barbados had almost nothing left to offer them. The island was one enormous sugar plantation. Emancipation had ended slavery decades earlier, but a system of tied rent kept most agricultural workers laboring 5 days a week, simply for the right to live somewhere. Panama paid 10 cents an hour, and when they arrived, they found that the canal zone had 2 payrolls. White American workers were on what was called the gold roll. They were paid in gold coin. They were given a private room or a family house with plumbing and an icebox and schools and a clubhouse and paid leave and a doctor. Everyone else, the West Indians and the Spanish and Italian laborers who came alongside them, was on the silver roll, paid in silver, housed in barracks of stacked cots with nowhere to put anything they owned. Separate wages, separate housing, separate hospitals, separate queues at the commissary, separate entrances to the same buildings. It was Jim Crow, lifted out of the American South and rebuilt in Central America. And it did not end when the digging ended. It stayed in place, formally, for another 4 decades. The men on the silver roll did the excavating. They handled the dynamite. They cut the brush and stood in the water and worked the drills at the bottom of the cut. And they died at a rate that nobody on the gold roll came close to. Across both the French and the American efforts, the accepted figure is that around 25,000 people died building the Panama Canal. The great majority of them were black. Many of them lie in the hillsides above the channel their labor opened. The ships that pass beneath them do not slow down. And that channel needed one more thing to work, something no amount of digging could supply. It needed a lake. Here is the problem. A staircase of locks needs a reservoir at the top, a body of water held high above the sea, deep enough to float ships and large enough to be spent every single day without running out. There was no such lake in Panama, so they built one.
The Chagres River.
The river that had drowned the French was dammed near the Caribbean coast at a town called Gatún. The dam was an earth wall roughly 1.5 miles long. Behind it, the river backed up into its own valley and kept rising. When Gatún Lake filled, it covered about 160 square miles. At the time, it was the largest artificial lake in the world. Which means that for nearly half the length of the crossing, ships are not in a canal at all. They are sailing across a drowned valley, 26 meters above the sea, between hills that used to be hills. That is the trick. That is the entire trick. The Panama Canal is not a cut between two oceans. It is a lake, held up in the air with a set of stairs on either side of it. But a valley is not empty before you flood it. There were towns down there. The old village of Gatún, which gave its name to the dam, the lake, and the locks, sat where the water is now roughly 80 feet deep. There were other settlements strung along the river, farms, roads, churches, cemeteries, and a railway, the Panama Railroad, finished in 1855, the first railway ever to cross the Americas from one ocean to the other. Sections of its original line are under the lake. Beginning around 1908, the people who lived in those places were told to leave. Roughly 2,000 of them were moved. Their towns were emptied, then submerged. Some were given plots in a hastily built new town. Many simply scattered, and their communities never reassembled anywhere. And then something quieter happened, and it lasted a century. They were written out. The story the world was told afterwards was a story about engineers cutting a channel through empty jungle, not through a settled, farmed, inhabited landscape with a name for every bend in the river. The Panamanian historian Marixa Lasso went into the archives and reconstructed what had actually been there: the towns, the households, the streets, the people. She found a landscape that the official version had needed to be empty, and had therefore described as empty. The forest around Gatún Lake is genuinely magnificent. It is also, in places, a graveyard of towns. And yet, the same rising water that drowned all of that produced something nobody planned. When the lake filled, it did not cover everything. The highest ground stayed above the surface. Hilltops became islands. One of them is called Barro Colorado, Red Clay Island, about 15 square kilometers of forest that found itself quite suddenly surrounded by water on every side. In 1923, it was set aside as a reserve. A field station opened the following year with $17,000 of private money and a few rough huts. A century later, it is the most intensively studied patch of tropical forest on Earth. Around 400 scientists come to Barro Colorado every year. There is close to a century of unbroken climate data here. There are forest plots that have been surveyed, tree by tree, since 1980. Every trunk measured, mapped, and followed through its birth, its growth, and its death. More than 13,000 scientific papers have come out of this single island. Nowhere else in the tropics has been watched this closely for this long. There are roughly 400 species of bird here, 500 species of butterfly, 500 species of tree in an area you could walk across in an afternoon. Howler monkeys and spider monkeys and white-faced capuchins. Three-toed sloths hanging in the canopy with algae growing in their fur, moving so slowly that moths live in it. Central American agoutis on the forest floor, a rodent the size of a rabbit that buries seeds, forgets where it put most of them, and in doing so, plants a large share of the trees the entire watershed depends on. And crocodiles in the shallows at the island's edge, watching container ships pass a mile away. Then, there are the two civilizations that have been running this forest far longer than anyone else. Leafcutter ants do not eat leaves. That surprises almost everybody. They cut them, and they carry them, a green column moving through the litter like a slow procession. But they carry them underground to feed a fungus. The fungus digests the leaf. The ants eat the fungus. They weed it, they dose it with antibiotics they carry on their own bodies, and they have been farming it for something like 50 million years. A single mature colony can hold millions of individuals and shift as much earth as a small excavator. And then there are the ones that build nothing at all. Army ants have no nest. When the colony stops for the night, the workers link their legs and bodies together and hang from a log or a root, layer upon layer, until they have made a living structure the size of a football, with the queen and the young held in chambers inside it. The nest is made of ants. In the morning, it takes itself apart and walks away. All of this was happening on that hilltop before it was an island. It is still happening. The lake rose around them, and they carried on. The canal, it turns out, accidentally built a wildlife refuge. Gatún Lake and the forest around it are protected because the water is protected, and the water is protected because the ships need it. The most industrial thing in Panama is the reason the most biological thing in Panama still exists. But Panama is not only the canal, and it was a crossing long before anyone thought of digging one. On the Pacific shore, east of the modern city, a stone tower stands in a field of ruins. Panama Viejo was founded in 1519, the first permanent European settlement on the Pacific coast of the Americas. For 150 years, this is where the silver came. It came by ship from the mines of Peru, up the Pacific coast, and it was landed here. Then it was loaded onto mule trains and walked across the isthmus on the Camino Real, a paved royal road running through the same rainforest the canal now passes through. At the other end, it went aboard Spanish galleons for the crossing to Europe. Everything moved across Panama. The route is the country's oldest idea. In January 1671, an English privateer named Henry Morgan crossed the isthmus with more than 1,000 men, came out of the forest, and took the city. It burned. Whether Morgan's men set the fires or the retreating Spanish did is still argued about. The result is not. Panama Viejo was abandoned, and what remains of it, the cathedral tower, a few walls, the outline of streets, now stands at the edge of a modern capital, with glass towers rising directly behind it. The Spanish rebuilt 2 years later, further west, on a rocky peninsula that could be walled and defended. That settlement is Casco Viejo, the old quarter of Panama City. Balconies, shuttered windows, cracked pastel plaster. Half of it restored, half of it still open to the sky. From its sea wall, you can look across the bay at the skyline of the new city, and beyond that, at the ships lying at anchor, waiting their turn. 400 years of Panama in one line of sight. And on the other coast, the road ran out at the water. Portobello is a quiet Caribbean town now, fishing boats drawn up on the sand, Spanish cannon lying in the grass. For 2 centuries, it was one of the wealthiest places on Earth, for about 6 weeks a year. When the treasure fleet arrived, the town held a fair, Silver was stacked in the streets in bars, under guard, waiting to be loaded. Merchants came across the Atlantic for it. Then the fleet sailed, and the town went back to being a village in the rain. The forts that guarded it are still standing, half swallowed by vegetation. So is Fort San Lorenzo, on a cliff above the mouth of the Chagres, the same river that would one day be dammed to make the lake. And something else stayed in Portobello. The people brought here in chains to work the route did not lose everything. Congo culture, the music, the dance, the improvised street theater of the Congo tradition grew out of the communities of the enslaved and of those who escaped into the forest, and it is still performed here, in costume, in the street, in a town most of the world has forgotten was ever important. And every October, tens of thousands of pilgrims walk to Portobello, some of them covering the last miles on their knees, to stand before a dark wooden figure of Christ that has been in this church since the 17th century. They come for a village of a few thousand people on the bay where the silver used to sit. Beyond the canal corridor, the country widens out. Northwest, on the Caribbean, the islands of Bocas del Toro sit over clear water on wooden stilts. A second West Indian shore, where the banana companies once ran everything, and the English of Barbados and Jamaica is still in the accent. Inland, in the highlands, Boquete grows coffee in volcanic soil beside Volcan Baru. It is the highest point in the country, and on the rare clear morning from the summit, you can see both oceans at once. South, in the Pacific, lies Coiba, for most of the 20th century, a penal colony so feared that nobody went near it. The forest was left alone. Today, it is one of the great marine parks of the Eastern Pacific, protected largely because for 80 years it was somewhere people did not want to go. Off the Pacific coast, the Pearl Islands scatter across the Gulf of Panama, where the Spanish took the pearls and where the silver route began. And above the canal itself, in the hills, there is a second reservoir, Lake Alajuela, smaller than Gatún and quieter, holding back the upper Chagres. It is the reserve tank. When the rains fail, it is what the canal draws down first. Somewhere in the canopy above that water is a bird that most Panamanians will never see. The harpy eagle is the national bird, and it is one of the most powerful raptors alive, talons the size of a grown man's hand, strong enough to take a monkey or a sloth out of the treetops in a single pass. It hunts inside the forest, not above it, weaving between trunks at speed, which means it needs the canopy unbroken. It needs exactly the thing the watershed needs. Protect the water, and you protect the eagle. There is no version where one survives and the other does not. But there is one more thing the canal cost, and it took most of a century to pay back. The treaty that created the Panama Canal was signed in 1903 in Washington by a Frenchman. Philippe Bunau-Varilla had worked on the failed French canal and had a financial stake in the American one succeeding. He signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty on behalf of a Panamanian republic that was about 2 weeks old, and he did it before the Panamanian delegation arrived to negotiate. It handed the United States a strip of land 10 miles wide, cutting the country in half in perpetuity. The canal zone was not a base. It was a country inside a country. It had its own police, its own courts, its own schools, its own postal service, and its own flag. Panamanians could not live in it. For much of its existence, they could barely work in it, and they could not fly their own flag there. January 9th, 1964. A group of students from a school in Panama City walk into the canal zone carrying a Panamanian flag to raise it beside the American one at a zone high school, as an agreement had said they could.
There is a scuffle.
The flag is torn. The students walk back out, and the news moves faster than they do. Within hours, thousands of Panamanians are at the fence. The riots last 3 days. By the end of them, more than 20 Panamanians are dead, along with several Americans. They are called the martyrs. January the 9th is a national holiday in Panama, and it is not a celebration. 13 years later, Omar Torrijos and Jimmy Carter signed the treaties that set an ending date. On the 31st of December, 1999, at noon, the canal became Panamanian. The zone was gone. The bases were gone. The country was whole for the first time since it had been a country. Panama has run the canal ever since and has run it well. Every dollar of toll goes to Panama now, which means every problem the canal has is also Panama's problem, including the water. And on the coast, the water has become someone else's problem entirely. Off the Caribbean shore, east of Colón, lie the islands of Gunayala, 365 of them, one for every day of the year, and roughly 50 of them inhabited. The Guna came here from the forests of the Darien generations ago, fleeing disease and conquest, and they built a life entirely out of the sea. They govern themselves under their own laws and their own Congress. They fish, they sail. The women sew molas, layered, cutaway panels of cloth, made and worn and sold, and instantly recognizable anywhere in the Americas. Their islands sit between half a meter and a meter above the water. The sea around Gadi Sugdub is rising at about 3.5 millimeters a year, nearly double the rate measured in the 1960s. The floods that used to come in a bad storm now come with a high tide. Residents mine coral from the reef and stack it against their own doorsteps to buy time. In June 2024, about 300 families, roughly 1,300 people, left Gadi Sugdub and moved to a new settlement on the mainland called Isber Yala. It was the first planned climate relocation of its kind in Latin America. It had been the community's own idea, first raised in the 1990s, and it took more than a decade of asking. It has not been simple. The waste disposal was not ready. The school had no water. The clinic was not usable. Around 100 people refused to leave the island at all and are still there. Panama's Environment Ministry has identified more than 60 other communities at risk of going under. So consider where that leaves this country. On one coast, the ocean is arriving. On the other, the rain is failing to. And in the mountains between them, there is a small, yellow frog. The Panamanian golden frog is the national symbol. It appears on lottery tickets. It is a sign of luck. It lived along fast, cold streams in the highlands above El Valle de Anton, a town that sits inside the crater of an extinct volcano. It cannot croak loudly enough to be heard over the waterfalls it breeds beside. So it waves. Golden frogs signal to each other by lifting a hand and rotating it, a semaphore no other frog in the region uses. In the late 1980s, a fungus arrived in Central America. It infects the skin of amphibians and disrupts the balance of salt and water across it until the heart stops. Scientists watched it move down the mountains of Panama, valley by valley, and they could predict where it would arrive next. It reached El Valle, the last stronghold, around 2004. The golden frogs were gone within months. The last one seen in the wild was seen in 2009. For 16 years, the national animal of Panama existed only in glass tanks. And then recently, they began putting them back. Captive-bred golden frogs, raised in biosecure rooms in El Valle and at the Smithsonian's Rescue Project, were carried up into the forest and released into mesh pens beside the streams their great-grandparents came from, to find out whether a frog raised in a box can rebuild the toxins and the skin bacteria it needs to survive the fungus that is still out there. Most of them died. Some did not. The survivors were released into the open forest.
Nobody knows yet whether it worked.
That is the honest answer, and it is the same honest answer that hangs over everything else in this country. Because the water is the question. It has always been the water. In 2016, after 9 years of work, Panama opened a second, larger set of locks. Agua Clara on the Caribbean side, Cocoli on the Pacific, big enough for a class of ship that had not been able to cross before. The new locks were built with water-saving basins. Instead of dumping every lockage into the sea, they drain part of it sideways into shallow reservoirs and reuse it on the next ship. They recover roughly 60% of the water. Engineering trying to outrun the rain. But bigger locks mean bigger ships, and bigger ships mean deeper water and more of it. Meanwhile, Gatún Lake is not only a shipping reservoir, it is also the drinking water for more than half the population of Panama, including both of its major cities. The lake has to fill the locks and fill the taps, and it is filled by nothing but weather. And then came 2023. Panama had one of the driest years in its recorded history. The rainy season simply underdelivered, month after month. And by the start of 2024, the water in Gatún Lake stood almost 6 feet lower than it had a year earlier, the lowest January level ever measured. Transits were cut from 36 a day to 24, then lower. Draft limits fell. Container ships crossed half empty or did not cross at all. The queue at both ends grew and stayed. 6% of global maritime trade slowed down for over a year because of rainfall over a watershed you cannot see from space. The rain came back. It always has so far. By 2025, the lake was full again. Ships were crossing at 50 feet of draft. And by early 2026, Gatún was so high that the authority was opening spillways to let water out. But that is not a solution. That is a reprieve. The forecasts for the end of this century show something simple and unwelcome. Under a high emissions path, the low water years that currently shut the canal down become ordinary years. The drought stops being an event and becomes the climate. So Panama has made a decision. West of the canal, a river called the Rio Indio runs 98 kilometers out of the hills to the Caribbean. It is a valley of small farms, coffee, plantain, cattle, subsistence agriculture, with villages scattered along the water. Boca de Uracillo, Limón de Chagres, Los Uveros. Places of 200 people, reachable by dirt road or by boat. The plan is to dam it. A reservoir of 4,600 hectares, a 9-kilometer tunnel bored through the hills so the water can run into Gatún Lake by gravity with no pumps forever. A price of $1.6 billion. Construction on the main works targeted to begin in 2028 and finish around 2031. It would secure the canal's water and the drinking water of more than half the country for perhaps 50 years. And it would put the valley underwater. Around 500 families live in the flood zone, roughly 2,000 people. 2,000 people, the same number that were moved out of the Chagres Valley in 1908 when they built the first lake. A century apart, in the same country, for the same waterway, the same arithmetic. The Canal Authority has done what it has learned to do. It has run a census. It has held more than 200 meetings and reached about 70% of the affected households. It has published a compensation framework, replacement housing with title, payment for crops and livestock and lost income, support during the transition, a yearly payment for families who join the Livelihood Restoration Program. It has promised resettlement sites within a few kilometers so that families are not scattered. Karina Vergara, who manages the social and environmental side of the project, has spent years sitting in those meetings. The first group is expected to move soon, around 50 families. 200 people from El Limón de Chagres, where the dam works will begin. And the valley is fighting. Farmers have organized. They have marched on the capital. They have taken the project to Panama's Supreme Court, been dismissed on procedure, and filed again. They have asked the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to intervene. Their argument is not sentimental, it is this: if the Rio Indio can be taken, then the next river can be taken, and the one after that. And an 88-year-old man in Limón de Chagres will tell you, if you ask him, that he has watched the water level in his own river fall for decades, and that a reservoir built on a shrinking river is not a guarantee of anything. The authority says there is no better option, that it's studied a dozen alternatives, that gravity makes the Rio Indio the cheapest and most reliable water Panama can reach. Both of these things may be true at the same time. That is the thing that makes this hard. The canal is not a villain here. It is the reason Panama has hospitals and roads and a reason for the forest to stand. The people of the Rio Indio are not obstacles. They are farmers who did nothing to warm the planet and are being asked to give up their valley because it has been warmed. And the ships will keep coming because the world has built itself around the assumption that this 50-mile shortcut will always be open. Stand at Miraflores in the late afternoon and watch a ship come up the stairs. The gates close behind it, the valves open, and the water rises out of the floor of the chamber without a single pump, without a single motor, moved by nothing but the weight of a lake sitting higher up the hill. 900 feet of steel goes up like something weightless. Then the last gate opens, and the water that lifted it, 200 million liters of rain that fell on a Central American mountain range, runs out into the Pacific and is gone. And another ship comes in behind it. 3 million years ago, this narrow strip of land rose out of the sea and closed the gap between two oceans. It redirected the currents. It changed the weather of half the world. Now the weather of half the world has come back to Panama, and it is standing at the top of the locks with a hand on the valve. The rain will come back this year, almost certainly. Whether it comes back every year for the next 100, nobody can promise that. The canal was designed for a climate that is no longer guaranteed, and the fix for it requires drowning a valley of farmers for the second time in a century in a country that is still learning how to tell the truth about the first time. The ships will keep coming, that much is certain. The rain is the part nobody controls. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey.